Rain rattled the hospital's windows like tossed gravel while a gull screeched somewhere in the coastal dark. Pushing his quiet cart, Elias Thornton paused outside a conference room where a voice cracked with wealth and terror. "If you teach her to speak again, I'll give you everything," shouted the CEO, Victor Langston. A measured reply followed, phrases about treatment plans, plateaus, and time. But the name that slipped through the door froze him. Clara, the child who watched the Pacific without blinking, the child who hadn't shaped a word since headlights spun across wet asphalt on Highway 101. He pressed his palm to the cool glass. Inside, a chart trembled on an easel. A man paced, jaw clenched so hard it whitened. Another woman therapist, clipboard firm kept, her tone steady while fear bent the air. Elias had spent months mopping these halls, memorizing the rhythm of ventilators and the tide's slow thud against the breakwater. He knew where the corridor smelled of iodine, where salt fog gathered like breath near the loading bay, where Clara sat with a blanket on her knees, counting waves with her eyes. Once, long ago, he had coached shy voices into poems in a sunlit classroom. Then winter came, and a siren cut that half-life. A buoy tolled beyond the parking lot, measured, solemn, as if calling roll for souls washed thin by grief. He thought of the little red shoes he'd stored in a shoebox, the apology that never found a mouth. Victor's footsteps halted. "Name your price," the man said. "Raw. Anyone who can make her speak." Elias glanced at his own hands, scar across one knuckle, knuckles scrubbed clean, and heard an answer he hadn't intended to give rise inside him. His feet carried him forward. "What happened next will shock you." Elias Thornton pushed his cart along the pediatric wing while dawn seeped through. Oregon's coastal fog and the breakwater took the tide's steady blows. Elias favored this hour. The hospital hums low. The corridors are nearly empty. The world measured enough to quiet hands that still remembered sirens. He emptied bins, wiped glass, straightened chairs, and listened. Before the uniform and the jangling keys, he had taught second graders a few miles inland, chalk decorating his cuffs. While shy voices rose to meet poems, a jar of smooth stone sat on his desk, each pebble earned when a child read aloud. After school, his daughter would race across the yard in a red coat, cheeks bright with winter air. He had promised a tide pool walk and biscuits shaped like stars. A truck slid on black ice, a guardrail failed, and the jar became a box wrapped in newspaper. The classroom fell silent. He followed different hallways, basements, and linen rooms. Grief needed a task, so he gave it study. In a narrow apartment above a bait shop where salt filmed the windows, he opened textbooks on trauma psychology and highlighted pages. He watched lectures, practiced breathing exercises between loads of laundry, and met a retired counselor weekly. Work paid the bills. Learning rebuilt a purpose. He could not amend the past, yet he could practice the kind of presence that invites a frightened body to trust air again. Seaside Children's Hospital gave him rooms to polish and a garden to sweep. Beyond the hedges, waves worked the shore, pounding driftwood into benches. On fog days, the world is reduced to silhouettes and a buoy's bell. Names moved through those hallways like tides. Elias never pried, yet stories crossed thresholds. One story stayed. Clara Langston, a girl who had not spoken since headlights spun across wet asphalt on Highway 101. Staff said. She sat in the garden and counted waves with her eyes. She answered questions by turning away or holding still. Language lived somewhere behind her gaze and would not come forward. Her father, Victor Langston, arrived with suits and a grief no wardrobe could disguise. He ran a company that filled business pages and made decisions measured in millions. Yet here he stood at a window, hands shaking. He flew in specialists, devices, and assessments, filling schedules with laminated certainty. Therapists described plateaus, strategies, and incremental goals. None of it summoned a syllable. Elias first saw Clara while sweeping needles from the garden path. She held a shell and traced its spiral eyes fixed on the seam where sea met sky. He hummed a tune he once used in class and let the broom speak. When she shifted, he stepped back. Attention can weigh more than silence. The next morning, he returned at the same time, consistent and unhurried. A nurse adjusted a shade to blunt glare. A therapist crossed the walkway with flashcards. Victor watched from inside, phone idle in his palm. Later, through a door left ajar, Elias heard Victor's voice crack against the white walls of a conference room he spoke of flights, fees, charts, and promises that failed where it mattered. He sounded like a father bargaining with an ocean. The sound followed Elias into the night. Back in his apartment, he reread a chapter on safety. Healing, the page said, begins when control loosens and a steady witness holds the room. He pictured the bench, the blanket, the small profile against the horizon. He thought of the jar and how each stone marked a moment when sound crossed into air. Morning returned in slow silver. Fog draped the courtyard until buildings looked drawn in pencil. Elias finished the supply closets and paused in the family room. Victor stood by the window with a photograph in his hand, a candid of a laughing child buried in soap bubbles, one palm raised as if stopping time. His tie hung loose, his eyes were raw. Elias knocked on the frame and waited. Victor turned as if bracing for another report. Instead, he saw a janitor with sleeves rolled, cap in hand. "I work maintenance," Elias said, voice steady. "I used to teach. I'm studying trauma psychology in the evenings. I don't want to interfere. If you allow it, I can sit near the garden when your daughter visits, read on a bench, hum sometimes, and sweep the path. No questions, no demands. If she looks my way, I'll look at the horizon. If she moves, I'll step back. I cannot promise outcomes. I can offer a kind presence." Victor frowned, not at the man but at the suggestion that gentleness might succeed where strategy failed. He asked for credentials, then stopped, recognizing the only one that mattered here: patience without pride. Skepticism arrived quickly. A therapist stepped forward with professional caution, outlining boundaries and asking for updates while ensuring nothing disrupted care. Elias agreed to every line. He wanted no authority, only to be a steady shape in the periphery. They granted a brief trial with strict conditions. That afternoon, the drizzle settled on shrubs. Elias swept while Clara sat with a blanket tucked under her legs. He read a page from a worn book of coastal poems under his breath, the words for himself, and let quiet stretch between sentences until it felt honest. The gull that patrolled the roof dipped once and was gone. Victor stood inside, arms folded, every muscle resisting the urge to intervene. Minutes became an hour measured by a buoy's bell and the soft scrape of bristles over stone. No miracle, no collapse, only a quiet that did not bruise. The staff kept their distance. Elias showed up at the same time the next day, and the next, never praising himself for restraint, never reaching for results. He asked nurses when Clara planned to visit and set his cart where she could see it. Victor said little, ate less, and kept returning to the glass with a gaze that looked like prayer after faith. Meanwhile, Elias continued reading about speech, retreating to shield memory and how calm can be loaned. He carried those lessons into the garden. He could not pull anyone from tides, but he could make the shoreline steady. The path shone under his mop, the benches dried under his towel. He greeted Clara's presence with quiet reverence. When she glanced sideways, he allowed himself only the smallest nod, then returned to the page, to the horizon, to the broom. Wind carried salt through the sliding doors, softening the smell of antiseptic and coffee. Night shift jokes faded when Clara entered, and every voice lowered without instruction. Even Victor whispered. Around them, Oregon kept breathing. The foghorn marked intervals like a slow heartbeat. Victor's desperation did not fade, yet its edges softened as hours accumulated without pressure. He began to ask about books, classroom tricks, and what to do with his hands. Elias answered in a few words, and with great patience. He did not sell a method, only a presence shaped by loss and practice. Skeptics kept their watch. The ocean kept time. Inside that frame, a small space opened where hope could sit without shattering. Could one person's kindness unlock a silent world? Morning softened the Oregon coast, until the courtyard looked sketched in graphite, salt bright on hedges, dew strung along bench slats, and Elias Thornton rolled his cart to the garden as if arriving early to tune an invisible instrument. He set a worn book on his knee, smoothed the crease with his thumb, and let 3 low notes hum from his chest, the sound barely audible above a buoy's patient bell beyond the loading bay. Inside the glass, Victor Langston stood with a cooling cup, tie slack, eyes taut with a father's hunger. Clara entered with a blanket across her lap, wool hat shading her brow, wheelchair gliding to a stop beside the rosemary bed. She took the horizons measure the way surveyors read a coastline, gaze steady, jaw soft, breath shallow. Elias did not greet her. He turned a page, read a single line about driftwood polished by years of water, and allowed quiet to reclaim the space. When gulls quarreled near the lights, he lowered his hum. When their wings stilled, he let silence hold. Wind carried kelp, rain, and iron from the railings, and those scents built a room that felt less like a clinic and more like weather. Minutes stacked like rounded stones. A nurse adjusted a shade. An orderly crossed the walkway. Elias rolled a pinnacone along the bench until soft clicks stitched a thin rhythm, then set it down. He remembered children in a classroom tasting words like satin, rasp, and crisp, and let the memory sink without dragging him under. He read about tide pools, where glassy shrimp hide between anemone crowns, then closed the book and rested a palm on the cover as though steadying a skiff. Across the path, Clara freed fabric from her wrist with a careful tug. He answered with stillness, because small claims bloom best without applause. The fog retreated at town block toward the headland, scraping blue into view. Waves rose into green shoulders, curled white, and collapsed against basalt with clockwork certainty. Each crash lent the courtyard a pulse. Elias let his breathing match it. Clara's lashes lowered. Her chest traced the long retreat. Victor's jaw unlocked, and set again, hope rising, sinking, rising. Specialists had offered plans. Invoices had followed. Silence remained. Through the glass, he searched the bench for a sign that this slow work was not capitulation. Elias refused to sell a promise. He kept company with the hour. Sunlight finally touched rosemary tips, releasing a clean brightness that made the air tastes like lemon. The child's head angled a fraction toward a spiderweb strung between leaves. Dew beaded along the strands, tiny pearls arranged by careful math. Elias let his eyes follow the same line. Then he looked away toward the horizon so the discovery stayed hers. Victor saw the tilt, pressed his forehead to the glass, and whispered a syllable that fogged the pain. A delivery truck grumbled past, then dissolved into the distance. Elias resumed humming, 3 notes rising, pausing, and falling like a tide deciding itself. A gull hopped along the railing, peered with one bright eye, and flung itself into grey. A lone feather clung to the metal and trembled. Clara's fingers found a loose thread at the blanket's edge, looped it once, then let it fall. He answered by turning a page. Lunch arrived with tray clatter and friendly rumor. Victor's assistant mentioned a meeting the calendar still claimed. He waved it off without turning. The CEO balanced urgency like a hot plate, aware that any sudden movement could spill everything. Elias widened his quiet to hold that tremor. The ocean obliged with an even set that skimmed stone like a hand smoothing a child's hair. The wheelchair brake clicked under a nurse's check and was forgotten. Nothing happened, which was precisely the point, nothing that bruised. Mid-afternoon brought a small test. A maintenance worker asked to open a nearby gate. Elias slid his cart aside, nodded once, and let the brief clink of tools pass like a short squall. When stillness returned, he read a paragraph about sandstone bowls that hold rain between storms. He pictured those bowls cradling a future sound and folded the wish away so it would not press. Victor approached the outer door, hand hovering, near the handle, falling, hovering again. Action promised relief. Restraint offered respect. He chose restraint and stood back. Elias shifted his gaze to the line where sky paled toward evening. So if Clara looked up, she would meet a profile that offered companionship rather than inspection. The buoy told once, then rested, as if harbor water had learned patience from grief. A cloud crossed the sun. Coffee and bleach edged the air again. A volunteer exchanged the blanket for a softer one, a movement as light as a page turning. Elias smiled at a passage about kelp forests, swaying like slow parades, and let the smile fade before it could land as approval. He closed his eyes for 2 breaths and listened for tiny assurances. Fabric whisper, steady inhale, a small throat clearing that announced safety by existing at all. He stored them like pebbles in a jar only he could see. Victor stepped away from the window and leaned against the corridor wall. It looked like surrender and felt like faith. He rubbed his thumb along a paper cup ridge, set the cup down, and walked off toward nowhere in particular. The door clicked, and a gentle quiet followed, lighter by a degree. Elias flicked his eyes toward the chair without moving his head. Clara held the thread, unspooled it, watched how light laced the fiber, then wrapped it again. He returned to the horizon, offering privacy that did not abandon. A gust pushed a sheet of mist across the courtyard, blurring edges into silhouettes. Man on bench, child in chair, hedge strung with water. The sheet slid on, leaving droplets clinging to the glass. In the softened light, Elias told a small story about a cove hidden behind a basalt shoulder, where tidal water stays clear when crowds pass it by. He spoke as if recalling a map, not giving advice. The words fell like shells into a pocket. Clara angled her head toward the sound and then returned to the horizon, as if confirming the cove's direction. He accepted the movement like the weather, grateful, not possessive. Shadows lengthened. Shift change murmured through the building. The gull feather lifted from the railing seam and sailed down to rest near a wheel of the cart. Elias left it where it landed because leaving can give more than taking. He gathered his book, folded the towel into a square, and stood. He told the nurse he was stepping away, voice smooth, steps unhurried. Before he passed through the door, he looked at the grey seam of sea and the back of a wool hat and filed both images where they would not blur. A question rose, the one that had followed him since the night he heard a bargain scrape white walls, and a child not answer any voice that pressed. What does it mean to see someone truly? He did not expect truth to arrive as fireworks. He expected another hour tomorrow, another hum, another page, and the coastline continuing its old instruction. Rock yields not to force but to return. Behind the glass, Victor found his way back and watched the courtyard empty. Doubt stayed, thinner now, braided with a steadier hope shaped like a candle cupped against wind. The ocean kept its argument with stone, and the hospital eased into the evening. Elias walked the corridor with keys, making soft music at his hip, carrying nothing billable and everything he had learned about patience, shelter, and attention that does not flinch. The day had offered no word. It had offered rhythm, which, for now, was enough. The coast woke beneath a thinning veil of fog, firs marching down the bluff like quiet sentries, and Elias took his place on the garden bench with his book closed, because today he wanted the forest to come from memory. He spoke softly about a creek where salmon flash after October rains, a path that slips through sword ferns tall enough to meet overhead, nurse logs quilted with moss, and light that filters like patience. Clara kept her gaze on the horizon, yet her shoulders eased a fraction beneath the blanket. Elias did not praise the change. He let it live like weather. He mentioned salal berries that stained the tongue, banana slugs shining like slow gold, and owls whose calls sound like questions asked twice. A gull landed, stared, and swooped toward the surf, and he resisted pointing, trusting discovery to remain hers. Inside the glass, Victor Langston watched with the humility of a man who would buy time if money could make it. His hands opened and closed on a paper cup while he searched the bench for proof that gentleness was not surrender. When the wind shifted, Elias lowered his tone until it rode the air the way a small boat rides a swell gently. He spoke of duff after rain, the hush that arrives when snow surprises the coastal range, a creek writing itself around stones. Clara tilted her head 1 degree and settled again. A therapist paused behind Victor, took a note, and moved on. Elias returned to trees, Sitka spruce holding fog like lace, deer tracks stitched across mud, woodpeckers tapping as steadily as carpenters. He kept the rhythm slow, offering images the way a guide lays smooth pebbles in a child's palm. Her hands left the edge of the blanket and rested open on her thighs. Her jaw softened. Victor saw the shift and swallowed. He had made promises in rooms that smelled of iodine and coffee. He had also made choices by roads that smelled of rain. Later, by the coffee machine, he admitted that on the day of the wreck, he insisted on a late start because a call could not be moved and a contract would not wait. Traffic thickened, fog turned to gauze, and he still argued for the highway. He had not held the wheel when the car spun, but the route had been his idea, and that thought gnawed him. Elias listened without verdict. He said memory chooses one burning frame, and that healing grows when the body learns present safety. Victor nodded, as if a weight shifted from one hand to the other. Afternoon returned Clara to the courtyard, hat low, a sprig of rosemary tucked between blanket folds. Elias began a rain-soaked loop near Cape Perpetua, giant spruce rising from ravines, streams chattering under fallen bridges, a nurse stump feeding a new trunk. He did not say the first time he showed that wonder. A small voice had laughed beside him. A therapy team joined Victor at the glass, faces studious. Later, In a small room, they asked Elias for a plan and a timeline. He answered that progress would look like breath settling, shoulders unlocking, eyes tracking, and that the mouth waits until the spine believes the room. They wanted more structure. He agreed to fixed hours, weather notes, and strict boundaries. One clinician warned that attachment to a janitor could blur roles. Elias promised humility and said he sought only to make the air safer. They gave guarded permission and reminded him that ethics hold, even when hearts break. Clara watched a spiderweb jeweled with dew. Elias described red cedar drinking fog, lichens brightening bark, and a winter wren sewing a song longer than its body. Her back eased, her hands opened, a breath stretched. Victor covered his face, then lowered his hands and steadied. Elias hummed 3 notes that matched the far surf-beating black rock. The sound carried no demand, only an honest echo of outside power reduced to a size a small chest might trust. A lock of hair escaped the hat and trembled. Kelp lifted its clean edge into the air. The clock ticked, the door clicked, and footsteps softened. The next morning brought a sky between ragged clouds. Elias shared a tributary near the Rogue where sunlight puddles under alder and maple. Bear prints looked like barefoot steps, and ravens trade jokes across ridges. Clara followed a bee nosing rosemary flowers. Her lips parted on a breath that approached, a word, and faded. He left the almost word alone, and recalled the first time he saw a marbled merlet drop from the canopy and level out above the foam. A creature that trusts tall trees as nurseries, and the largest water as a road. Victor stepped outside, hands in his coat, stopping short of the chair. He said he wished he had learned how to slow down before sirens taught him. Elias answered that wishing becomes useful when it moves a hand now. Victor nodded and stood quietly while gulls carved white arcs. A senior therapist approached, respected his sincerity, and still pressed for tasks, flashcards, picture schedules, and tokens for eye contact. Elias asked for a week more of quiet companionship before introducing anything that smells like performance. She agreed and logged every condition. The waves hammered basalt as if endorsing restraint. Days stacked. Elias adjusted stories to Clara's micro movements. When she leaned back, he talked about crowns lifting mist. When her fingers found fringe, he named textures: bark flaking like pastry, moss like wet velvet, fronds unrolling like green clocks. When her eyes tracked a shadow, he told of a hawk riding thermals over headlands as smooth as silk. He always spoke as if to the air, offering company without inquiry. Victor learned the craft of not interrupting. He brought coffee without spilling, kept shade, and started measuring time by the buoy's bell rather than emails. Once, under low clouds, he sat on the bench's far end, leaving a gulf no one needed to cross. His voice came out rough. He said he had trained his daughter to count buildings from the back seat because lists quieted him, and he feared that habit now kept language away. Elias said, "Counting can be a raft. Words climb aboard when the current slows." Victor studied the horizon until his shoulders dropped and whispered thanks that were not a payment. Behind the glass, disagreement grew. One therapist argued that nervous systems ignored deadlines and that breath and posture mattered as real change. Another insisted families expect programs, not gardens. Administration worried about optics. A billionaire, a janitor, no measurable milestones. A memo demanded weekly metrics. Elias filed logs: time present, weather, posture eased, hands open, exhale lengthened, gaze tracked B. Throat cleared, hat brim lifted. On paper, it looked like almost nothing. In the courtyard, it felt like scaffolding for a house not yet visible. Tension braided hope with risk. At dusk, a storm rolled in and painted the sea slate. Elias matched his hum to rain on metal and told a short memory of sheltering under cedar during a squall, learning that dry space can exist inside weather if the trunk is wide enough. Clara angled her head as though finding the exact leaf where drops landed. Lightning stayed offshore. Thunder arrived as a low compliment. Victor's coat darkened with spray. He met Elias's glance, a look that said he could hold his breath longer. Inside, debate continued. Outside, a small community took shape: man-child, sea, and a story that placed them among trunks older than every argument. The lights blinked. On the courtyard went silver. Elias closed with a hill where fog thins to reveal columns of bark. Each ring a year endured, each branch a hand extending patience. He spoke as if naming furniture in a familiar room. Clara's shoulders settled to a place they had never reached here. Elias rose slowly, gave the wind back its stage, and left with a simple conviction that equilibrium counts. Somewhere ahead, possibility waited like a footbridge appearing from mist, visible enough to change how each breath felt, close enough to keep everyone walking without rushing. The morning arrived with a veiled brightness, the kind Oregon keeps behind gauze, and the garden glistened as if the night had stitched silver along every seam. Elias Thornton rolled his cart to the far bench and left the book closed, choosing to let the day itself be the lesson. A groundskeeper had mentioned a rabbit family living under the rosemary, so he moved slowly, brushed dew from the seat, and hummed 3 low notes that matched the long breath of the surf. Clara came with her blanket and wool hat, wheelchair gliding until the nurse set the brake with a soft click. She faced the horizon the way a navigator reads a line between hope and weather. Elias kept his eyes on the hedge, then on the path, then on the loading bay, never on the child, and pushed a few crumbs of mulch aside with the broom's straw tip. A small grey shape peered out, whiskers twitching like tiny questions. The rabbit crept to the sunlight, nose working, paws barely disturbing the damp. Elias did not comment. He eased the broom back, lifted his hand a finger's width, and let the visitor claim its stage. Clara's shoulders unlocked a fraction, her left hand released a corner of the blanket, and the wool settled on her lap without her noticing. The rabbit nibbled a sprig, ears bright against the shrub, then vanished under the green. Elias let the quiet expand until it felt as big as the cliff beyond the hospital. Then he spoke to the air in a practical tone about how rabbits leave faint paths, called runs that thread through cover like secret streets. He kept the explanation brief and returned to silence before anyone could call it a performance. The buoy tolled once beyond the parking lot. The ocean answered with a slow collapse against basalt. From the glass corridor, Victor Langston watched, hands steadying a cup he was not drinking. He wanted signs. He dreaded signs. He wanted time to fold and bring back a voice without the memory that hid behind it. Elias sensed the watching without reacting. He knelt beside his cart and cupped a ladybug from the top, a bright bead with delicate legs that tickled his skin. He rested the tiny traveler on his knuckle and set his hand on the bench arm, palm open to the weather. Clara's gaze slid from the horizon to the red dot, then back to the pale line of sea. The glance lasted a heartbeat longer than yesterday. Her breath, which had been shallow for months, stretched by one count of the bell. Elias whispered a half-sentence about small wings hidden under hardcovers, then stopped, as if he had remembered a tool, and put it back in its drawer. The ladybug opened, revealed a flicker of soft motion, and drifted off toward the hedge. Clara's fingers rose a quarter inch, then settled again, as if the motion had surprised even her. Late morning brought a chill breeze sliding down from misty cliffs west of town. The headland wore a shawl of vapor that bunched and thinned, revealing spruce climbing the slope, and pale breakers trailing white threads across dark water. Those cliffs seemed to lean into the hospital like solemn witnesses, reminding everyone that endurance can be shaped from pressure. Victor stepped outside and stood at the far end of the bench, leaving a respectful span of air between his coat and the chair. His cup steamed without being lifted, while wind braided salt into the garden, and shook rosemary spikes. "She used to run after butterflies," he said, voice level yet frayed. "I would promise 5 minutes more, and then look at email and forget the sky." "You are here now," Elias said, offering no sermon, only room. A therapist cracked the door to remind him about wildlife. He showed empty hands and agreed to let the garden choose its guests. A hummingbird flashed in, a green ember that hovered near Clara's shoulder. SIP sipped at a blossom and perched on the rail with a heartbeat the eye could see. Clara turned toward it with a measured motion. Color visited her cheeks and did not run. When the bird vanished, she released a sound almost like a syllable and tucked it inside the next inhale. Elias did not name the moment. He hummed, paused, and let quiet reclaim the bench. By afternoon, a nurse approved a slow circuit along the accessible path that opened toward the bluff. Fog draped and lifted in thin sheets, revealing spruce climbing the slope and black pillars shouldering white water. The waves drew in, narrowed, and hurled themselves against the promontory until spray hung like powdered glass. Elias crouched and pointed not at the ocean, but at a snail crossing a warm paver by the front wheel. Shell lacquered, body extending, with delicate certainty. Clara watched the tiny traveler choose a line as steady as any promise, Her mouth softened. Her shoulders settled another notch without negotiation. "It carries home wherever it goes," Elias said, and left the truth. Alone. The foghorn called once and again, as if the harbor itself had learned to ask for patience. Clara lifted her right hand and held it above the stone, hovering in a shape that looked like permission, then let it fall as a wave crashed and retreated. Victor stood as if connected to her by a glass thread that would snap if he moved, while Elias breathed with the surf until his chest felt like a pool that could fill without spilling. They returned inside when the wind sharpened. While Clara rested, Victor met Elias near the vending machines, where coffee smelled of second thoughts. "I fear breaking whatever fragile thing you are building," he said, "and I fear more that I made it fragile." Elias spoke of a winter road, a lost child, and months when air would not stay, then said, "Cleaning gave structure, study gave language for fear, and quiet company taught breath to trust." "How do I help without pushing?" Victor asked. "Be predictable," Elias said. "Let quiet win arguments and trust her pace more than your panic. Can patience heal what wealth cannot? It can make room for healing to happen." They went back to the window as night gathered, and the bell kept time. Morning brought rain, stitching fine lines across the courtyard. Elias arrived. The rabbit hid, and the ladybug stayed tucked. The hummingbird did not return today. Clara sat under her hood, gaze fixed on the seam where water dimmed into sky. Elias let the hour collect until the world felt uncreased. Then sunlight cut through an opening and laid a bar across the waves. Clara raised her hand higher than before, palm tilted toward that bright strip. Her mouth formed the beginning of a sound the coast has spoken forever, the front of a word. It faltered, yet the shape stayed on her lips like a promise written in salt, while Victor stood still and held his breath. Elias kept time with the surf and gave the moment nothing to resist, because some doors open best when nobody touches the knob. Wind skimmed the courtyard, combing rosemary until each spike glittered with mist. And Elias Thornton sat with measured ease, a steady outline inside a world still weighing its choices. Beyond the glass, the Pacific moved like iron breathing, long inhales dragging pale foam across basalt ledges, long exhales pulling shingle backward with a faint hiss. Clara rolled to her place, hat low, blanket tucked, eyes tuned to the horizon, as if reading a line written in light. Elias matched his breathing to the tide and let 3 quiet notes hum beneath the air, a phrase without request that kept the space open. Victor Langston stood inside with a cup he would not touch, shoulders squared by habit, shaken by love he could neither price nor schedule. Fog thinned, returned, thinned again, the headland drifting in and out like a memory choosing whether to stay. He smoothed the bench with one sweep, set his book down closed, and placed both hands palm down as if steadying a skiff. From the harbor, a bell marked distance in patient tones. Elias glanced once at the horizon, then at Clara's hands, then back to the marble seam where sea met sky, careful not to pin anything fragile. Salt sharpened the air. The child lifted her chin a fraction. Her shoulders, once locked high, drifted down one notch, a settling that passed through Elias like sunlight touching cold stone. Victor pressed his forehead to the glass, then drew back as if he had felt a current inside the pain. Staff gathered in ones and twos, friends made by repetition, skeptics polished by training, all drawn by a hush that felt purposeful. Elias traced a silent rhythm on the bench arm that matched the surf, an assurance that nothing here would arrive like a command. A break opened in the cloud bank, a bright seam that laid a luminous runway across the water. Clara watched that, banned as if the planet had exhaled a promise. Elias turned the tiniest fraction, so if she sought a face, she would meet a profile that offered company rather than pressure, and he let the quiet grow until it could carry weight. Victor stepped outside, stopped 3 paces from the bench, folded his hands, and anchored himself to patience. The bell sounded again. Clara's lips parted, her tongue lifted, breath gathered. A single syllable shaped itself at the mouth's front, a border between inside and open air. Elias stilled, not frozen but poised, a harbor refusing to tip a boat while it docks. Her gaze held the bright seam. Her chest rose and steadied around a cadence older than clinics or contracts. Then the sound arrived, fragile and whole. The quietest triumph the courtyard had known, a child's voice returning to daylight with one clear offering. Wave. The syllable hovered and flew, simple as a shell, complete as a bell note. let his breath out on a line as gentle as foam, a yes shaped like quiet rather than applause. Victor's knees bent as though gravity had turned tender. He pressed his sleeve to his eyes and laughed once, raw and grateful. The nurse at the door clapped both hands over her mouth, then lowered them without adding noise, because anything loud felt wrong near that first word. Clara kept her eyes on the seam of light, lips still rounded as if the word could land again. Elias answered with one hum, then silence, then a whisper, not directed at anyone. The sea says it back. Victor found a handkerchief and failed to use it. Tears had already made salt streaks along his cheeks. He moved one step toward the chair and stopped when a small hand lifted, holding him at a distance that meant love has a shape and he would honor it. Elias gave a slow nod, acknowledging that arrival belongs first to the traveler. Time reassembled around that syllable. The hospital leaned toward the garden and listened. A respiratory therapist crossed herself. An orderly wiped his eyes with a sleeve. A senior clinician whispered, "Oh," in a tone that held months of doubt softening into wonder. The word had not been coaxed by cards, prompted by tokens, or purchased with incentives. It had found its doorway through safety and returned carrying salt. Clara exhaled a longer breath, the kind bodies allow only when they trust the room. She lifted a finger toward the brightness and kept it there, and her hand did not tremble. Victor said her name as if touching water he had feared would always recede. She did not turn. She remained with the line she had named. Elias felt his history lift like fog off a cove, not gone, yet no longer sitting on the water. He had imagined this hour during long nights above the bait shop, highlighter bleeding through pages, kettle hissing while rain beat the sill. Yet, imagination had never matched the clean reality of one small sound bridging grief, and today, a speech therapist who preferred metrics steadied her breath and nodded once. A bow to an approach that looked like almost nothing until it gave everything. From the corridor came shoes and whispers and the far rasp of a printer, yet those noises felt like rain beyond a cove. The center of the hour remained a child, a sea, and a syllable that announced a continent of possibility. Elias asked the nurse for permission to move 2 steps closer, received a nod, and shifted into Clara's peripheral vision, where safety lives. He said, still to the air, that waves come in sets, some large, some low, none optional, all counted by coasts that have learned patience. Clara's finger traced a small horizontal line on the blanket. A smile visited, brief and honest. Victor placed his palm against the glass again and laughed through tears, then opened the door like a prayer and came to the bench's end without crossing the invisible line that kept trust intact. He whispered that he heard her, that he loved her, that nothing required answering now. It felt full, as if the coast had poured strength into a small frame and taught it how to stand. Elias shut his eyes and tasted resin, salt, coffee, and the first sweetness of relief. When he opened them, he saw Victor kneel on one knee, head bowed, suit forgotten, wealth irrelevant, father restored by a word gifted without negotiation. The corridor applauded in the quietest way a hospital can applaud, hands soft, smiles wide, pages silenced for one fragile minute. Elias nodded once and anchored the hour by naming nothing, because some victories shine brighter when left unadorned. The chief pediatrician arrived, read the faces, and bowed. A resident typed a note, then stopped and wrote one line. Witnessed an administrator who had argued for metrics, cleared his throat, shook Elias's hand, and said thank you. Victor called inside for Clara's scarf, received it, and held it to his heart like a relic. Across the bluff, mist lifted from spruce crowns, unveiling ribs that have endured every storm. Elias felt that same endurance move through the courtyard, not dramatic, not loud, real enough to stand. Clara kept her palm steady in that bar of light, as though confirming a map. Victor stayed at the boundary he had learned to respect, repeating her name like grace. Nurses exchanged looks needing no translation, relief traveling faster than rumor, softer than applause. The bell tolled more, and the hospital accepted the lesson a child had taught, safety first, then sound. Morning returned with a clarity that felt earned, and the courtyard seemed newly arranged, as if the night had dusted everything and set it back carefully. Clara arrived with her wool hat and a thinner blanket, eyes bright, posture easy. She watched the ocean for a long breath and then said, almost conversationally, "Blue line." The phrase entered the air with the simple grace of a kite catching steady wind. Elias Thornton felt a knot release, and answered with presence rather than praise, humming one low note. Inside the glass, Victor Langston pressed his palm to the window and whispered, "I'm here." Clara's gaze flicked toward him and returned to the horizon. A second later, she added, light moving by mid-morning, she tried, "Dad, okay," a spare blessing that turned Victor's posture from braced to grateful. Elias adjusted the bench cushion, set his book beside him closed, and spoke to the air about calm water pooling in sandstone bowls between storms. Clara traced a small line on the blanket and repeated, "Blue line," as if practicing steady footing. Victor stepped outside but stopped at a distance that maintained trust. He said only "Good morning," and waited. Clara whispered, "Morning," followed by Seabright, then breathed in, holding steady for 3 counts of the bell. The courtyard felt like a room learning a new grammar. A speech therapist asked for a short session in the garden. Cards stayed in pockets. They agreed the hour belonged to phrases rising from sight, sound, and warmth. Elias described a hawk lifting from the bluff and the way spruce holds fog like lace. Clara said, "Bird high," then fog soft, and flushed with a happiness that lit her eyes. Victor thanked the therapist with a nod that carried relief without triumph. By evening, permission arrived for a supervised loop to the overlook. The next day, a slow parade formed, a wheelchair at an unhurried pace, Elias beside the cart, Victor at a respectful distance, a nurse steering possibilities with a light touch. The path rose toward the headland, and beyond the parking lot, the forest began, tall trunks anchoring the ridge with green patience. Wind combed needles until the trees whispered in even breaths. Elias told a brief story about nurse logs feeding new saplings and ring counts that turned storms into history. Clara listened, neck relaxed, and said, "Trees listen." She followed with, "Air clean," and even, "Feet want ground," then grinned at her sentence. Victor laughed softly and said, "Mine too," and that honest agreement felt like a bridge lowering. At the overlook, they saw basalt stacked in black ribs. Elias rested a palm on the bench back and did nothing else. Clara pointed toward a break in the clouds and said, "Light door," which made the nurse shake her head in quiet wonder. Victor told Elias he had believed solutions must be fast and visible. That waiting signaled weakness. Elias replied that stillness can be an action when it chooses safety. Back at the hospital, the team noted one plain sentence, spontaneous phrases in a natural context. Skepticism softened because a child had taken space and made sound without fear. The following afternoon, the forest became the classroom. Weather held, and the nurse led them along a short accessible trail at the edge of the trees. Ferns arched over the path. A wren stitched a quick song from a stump. Elias named textures the way a baker names flowers: velvet moss, rough cedar, powdery lichen, smooth salal. Clara repeated some quietly, and then made her pairing, moss cool. She touched a pinch with permission, held it between finger and thumb, and smiled. Victor kept his hands loose rather than ready. He learned to step when asked and stand when not. On the return loop, Clara said, "Dad, walk near," and he moved into the space she opened without closing it. That evening, he and Elias studied an old topographic map and talked about repetition, ring by ring, day by day. Clara's voice gathered momentum over the week. In the courtyard she said, "Rabbit home," when the grey shape flashed under rosemary, and bird sip, when a hummingbird visited and left. With the therapist, she practiced naming the present, hat on, hands warm, bench dry. She surprised everyone by adding, "Read later," a plan tucked inside 2 words. At breakfast, she told Victor, "Sit near the window," and watched gulls ride crosswinds. On a day when clouds hung like wool, they returned to the overlook. The ocean wore slate. The forest flew deep green. Elias let the hour run. Clara said, "Hear trees," then, "Smell rain," and later, "Hands okay." Her shoulders found a new resting place, lower than before, as if the body had finally believed the territory was safe. Victor's gratitude showed as quiet attention. He brought better blankets, thicker socks, and a thermos that kept tea warm through long pauses. His phone stayed in his pocket. He asked Elias how to hold progress without clutching it. Elias said, "The way to hold water is to widen the bowl." Staff who had doubted began asking gentle questions. One clinician apologized for earlier sharpness and asked how to practice this patience with other families. Elias answered that consistency, consent, and warmth are not glamorous, yet they move mountains. Clara's therapist designed a light structure around routines that felt natural: morning garden, midday reading, afternoon rest, evening story. Clara accepted the pattern and added her touches, requesting Song 3, the hum that matched the harbor bell, and pine smell, a branch set near the chair. As nights passed, mornings improved. On a clear day, the nurse suggested a picnic at a turnout shaded by spruce. They went, carrying tea, crackers, and a book with thick pages. The cliff nearby held a steady roar, like a blanket of sound. Clara ate, watched clouds pull thin threads across the blue, and said, "Together good." Victor leaned on the rail and let the phrase root. Elias listened to the sea lay down another mile of patience. When they returned, paperwork awaited, approvals for longer outings, and notes for the growing file. Victor signed with a steadiness that no longer needed to grip. He met Elias's eyes and said leadership at home might mean quiet most of the time. At dusk, Clara stood with help near the garden rail. She looked at the horizon and said, "I'm safe here." The sentence lifted every face within earshot. Elias nodded, keeping the tear where it belonged. Before sleep, Victor taped a small reminder to his wallet: "Listen first." Clara slept with a rosemary sprig near her pillow. Elias walked home under a sky rinsed of color, cedar in his clothes, and a steadiness in his gait that had not existed a month ago. Outside his building, he paused to watch stars find their places above the dark headland. He thought about rooms, made safe by presence, and the way voices return when they are met with patience rather than pressure. For a child, a parent, or yourself. Then he asked himself, and anyone willing to try, a question both urgent and hopeful: what could you do to help someone feel safe? By the end of the month, the pediatric wing moved with a new kind of quiet, not the brittle hush of fear, but a steadier balance born of trust. And nurses noticed first. Monitors still blinked, and pages still chirped, yet rooms felt warmer, because teams began borrowing the garden's rhythm for daily care: trimming noise, slowing entrances, letting breath lead the hour. A simple note by the courtyard invited colleagues to observe low-pressure companionship hours, a practice modeled after Elias Thornton's bench time with Clara and adjusted for children who guarded words. Nobody called it a method. People just showed up, sat closer to windows, matched their breathing to the bell beyond the loading bay, and let silence do part of the lifting. Word of Clara's return to voice traveled quietly, as permission to hope rather than a spectacle. In the playroom, a child who once spoke only to a worn stuffed otter began naming colors while stacking blocks. In oncology, a teen tapped a rhythm after a nurse matched steps to the harbor bell. The charge nurse proposed weekly circles where staff shared small wins and practiced trauma-informed habits. And people arrived tired, left steadier, and returned with stories about calmer mornings. Elias joined when asked, speaking without titles, telling a plain story: safety before His colleagues leaned in, not because a janitor said it, but because the courtyard had already proved it true. Victor Langston met administrators in a corner office facing the headland, fog moving like slow thought across spruce while he laid out a plan. He would fund a pilot rooted in presence and patience, a program that gathered evidence without turning people into charts. The gift would train teams, redesign family rooms with softer light, seed therapy gardens, and support a unit tasked with translating principles into routines families could trust. He called it the Harbor Program because harbors shelter boats from violent water and provide a place to repair before the next tide. No splashy event, only a contract, an endowment, and a timeline built around seasons rather than headlines. Implementation reached from the basement to the roof. Environmental services coordinated with therapists, so cleaning never collided with delicate hours. Security revised greetings and slowed their stride near pediatrics. The cafeteria added a corner where lights stayed low and clocks ticked softly. A social worker placed a one-page primer in waiting rooms explaining how to meet frightened families without turning appointments into interrogations. The garden received a tiny plaque that read "Shared Quiet Helps," nothing more. Elias kept sweeping, humming 3 notes when needed, letting presence do the louder work. Clara widened the circle. On clear mornings, she ventured to the overlook, asking for pine scent, and song 3. She added phrases that lived close to the body: hands warm, seat steady, scarf softened, then surprised everyone with small leadership. Beckoning a younger patient to watch a hummingbird and pointing at clouds she called traveling pillows. Victor learned that failure, confessed and repaired, becomes a teacher instead of a guard, and he began to mentor parents who blamed themselves. He told them he was learning to listen first, to offer predictability, and to measure progress by comfort rather than applause. Elias slept more deeply. Dreams that had unspooled sirens opened onto coasts where driftwood looked like benches, not wreckage. On a Sunday, he walked a trail above the Nestaka, rain tapping Salal like polite applause, and stopped where the river curled toward open water. He rolled a pebble between his fingers, remembered the jar that once sat by his chalkboard, and set the stone on a stump with a whisper meant for the child he had lost. The ache stayed, but it no longer ran the hour. Back home, he brewed tea, highlighted another chapter on nervous systems, learning peace, and wrote 2 lines in a notebook: keep time, keep faith. In staff circles, skepticism softened without vanishing. Some clinicians still preferred sharply structured protocols and kept doubts polished. They were invited, not shamed, to try the slower path when cases stalled. Most found a balance. Diagnostic skill remained essential. Presence was no longer optional. On wet days, colleagues borrowed Ilyas's hum for difficult moments and reported Furesque. Data began to mirror what eyes already knew: longer, unbroken sleep, gentler vital signs during procedures, spontaneous language when nobody demanded performance, and fewer alarms in the evening. The program also reached out. A small team visited a clinic inland to support families recovering after wildfires, teaching predictable routines and quiet entrances. The hospital offered open sessions for community workers, teachers, paramedics, counselors who wanted to borrow calm from the garden. Victor attended with his sleeves rolled and listened more than he spoke. He promised scholarships for local staff to study trauma care and return to coastal towns. Policy memos turned humble, favoring short sentences and plain steps: dim lights, slow voice, ask permission, pause. People began to repeat 3 simple verbs: notice, invite, wait. And the building started sounding different at night. Clara's voice gathered steadiness. She read short lines with her therapist, picked C words from big print, and invented a game called Find Quiet, where she and Victor closed their eyes and named the faintest sound: a sleeve moving, a pine creaking, the bell far off. She asked Elias about his classroom and listened to a gentle story about a shy student who learned poems by holding a river stone while reading. That night, she tucked a pebble under her pillow and slept through, and in the morning, she announced, "Please, sit near the window," and watched gulls ride crosswinds. Victor formalized the endowment so the harbor program would outlast headlines and leadership changes. Legal teams drafted documents. Accountants mapped payouts that would hold steady through market weather, and the board signed without argument after touring companionship hours. He turned down interviews that chased drama and wrote quiet letters. 2 donors asking for patience. He told Elias that permanence rests in people. Elias nodded and said, "Culture is carpentry that never ends." The CEO began measuring good days by Clara's ease rather than by numbers on a screen. Change showed up in small places. A teenager on the surgical floor asked to keep a pine twig by the bed and slept longer. A toddler who flinched at gowns stopped startling when staff adopted softer shoes and slower entrances. Families began using new language. Instead of asking how to fix a child, they asked how to make a room feel kinder. The garden acquired a bench near the hedge for parents who needed to cry without leaving. Elias polished it every morning and set a small box of tissues underneath where rain could not reach. One evening, he lingered at the overlook after everyone had gone inside. The headland wore its shawl of cloud. Spruce crowded the ridge, and gulls tilted like scraps of paper. He thought about the first night he heard a desperate bargain scrape, a conference room wall, and how a single word on a bright seam pulled the hospital toward kindness. He recognized his grief without letting it take the lead, and felt, for the first time in years, that his future could hold more than labor and remembering. On the way back, he passed a poster near the elevators, an early rendering of a space, called the Langston Healing Center, pending community input, a place with rooms opening toward the the garden and lamplight that would not glare. Near the elevators, a poster appeared announcing a future space for trauma-informed care, a home with rooms opening toward the garden, and a small library filled with books on healing and the coast. The working title read Langston Healing Center. Pending community input, no ribbon, no fanfare. The paper went up like a kept promise, and staff touched the corner as they passed for good luck. On a bright coastal morning, doors opened on the Langston Healing Center, a low, timbered building that faced the ocean with calm windows and generous light. Wind combed through Sitka spruce above the path, while a bell from the harbor stitched slow beats across the courtyard. Visitors arrived without speeches, just steady footsteps, parents holding small hands, grandparents carrying hope in paper bags, nurses guiding with the quiet authority of people who have learned patience the hard way. Inside, rooms spread like coves, family spaces with soft lamps, therapy nooks near living plants, a small library of books on nervous systems, grief, and the coast. Plaques stayed modest, photographs honored teams rather than donors. Every corridor open toward something Oregon-y, forest, fog, or stone, so anyone frayed by travel could step toward what felt real. Elias Thornton stood at the entrance with a clean rag tucked in his pocket and a gentle smile that reached his eyes. He had polished every bench before sunrise and checked the garden twice for quiet corners. Victor Langston greeted families beside him, sleeves rolled, tie in his jacket, gaze softer than any boardroom had ever seen. Clara walked between them, hat off now, hair catching light, voice ready. She wore a small ribbon that read companion, and she took the role seriously, showing children how to breathe with the bell, how to find a seat that felt safe, and how to keep their hands warm while waiting. A boy afraid of elevators pressed his palm to the wall as Clara whispered steadily, and the doors opened without panic. A teen displaced by fire read a page in the library, halting at first, then finding rhythm as fog lifted from cedar crowns. Parents lowered their shoulders at the door because the building itself spoke kindness. Nurses charted in plain sentences that respected people more than graphs. Therapists shaped plans around comfort, not just milestones. Security learned the art of a quiet hello. Administrators measured success by nights when alarms stayed calm and families slept. The center's heart remained the garden. Beds of rosemary, salal, and huckleberry framed a path curving toward a view of dark rock and constant water. Benches hid in pockets where people could cry or breathe without an audience. A small sign reminded everyone, shared quiet helps. Elias kept to his rhythm, rolling the cart at dawn, humming 3 anchor notes when useful, greeting families with eye crinkles and space for feelings. Clara often joined him after school, talkative now, curious, quick with gentle humor. She told one anxious child that wave practice forever, so it is fine to take time. Elias answered that practice and kindness are cousins. They walked the loop, together, pointing out rabbit runs, spider jewelry, and the edge where sky keeps meeting water. For Elias, each lap softened a scar he had carried like iron. For Clara, each lap grew an inner meadow where sound could graze without fear. People noticed and borrowed that ease. Volunteers learned to hold pauses like gifts. Doctors discovered that a minute of stillness did more than a paragraph of reassurance. An ICU nurse placed a pine twig by a monitor and watched a heart rate settle. A respiratory therapist taught a father to sway with his baby until both breathed in sync. Data followed, but nobody chased it. Small outcomes added up. Fewer meltdowns during procedures, gentler nights, spontaneous phrases from kids who had refused prompts for months. Stories traveled. A clinic appraiser copied the garden model and sent a note back. Fewer tears, more sleep, less dread at dawn. A school counselor visited and left with plans for a quiet room beside the gym. The harbor program matured into muscle memory. Nobody asked if a janitor should mentor clinicians. Everyone understood that care honors whatever works and whoever brings it. Elias never took a title. He kept cleaning, studying, showing up on time, writing simple logs, and sharing what he knew without drama. Victor never forgot the night he bargained with the world. He now bargained with habits, trading urgency for steadiness, volume for respect. Clara formed a small club in the waiting area called Listeners, open to anyone willing to practice stillness before speaking. They wore tiny pins shaped like bells. On the first weekend after opening, a coastal storm rolled in at dawn. and the center leaned into it like a vessel trusting its keel. Wind drove fog against glass, surf pounded basalt, spruce bowed and rose. Elias checked drains, propped mats, and kept humming while families watched the water change moods. During a lull, Clara led a small caravan to the overlook. Umbrellas lifted like flags, steps measured, voices low. Victor followed without hurrying, hands in pockets, listening more than talking. At the rail, they looked over graphite waves braided with white. Clara lifted a palm and said, "Remember, we count on breath." Together they inhaled, exhaled, and let the roar become company. A boy said, "Big water friend," and his mother cried into her scarf and laughed at the same time. Elias stood close enough to help if needed, and far enough to honor courage. He thought of the stone jar that once lived on a classroom desk and felt, without wishing, that his lost child might approve of this borrowed second vocation. After the storm, sunlight broke through like a held note. Staff wheeled planters into warmer patches. Children chased gull shadows. A guitar found a tune that fit the room. Victor met with board members under a cedar arbor, outlining a plan to share the model across rural networks. He asked for patience, promised transparency, and refused any metric that punished slowness. The agreement came because stories had already convinced him. Evening brought a quiet gathering rather than a gala. Families read brief lines about moments that changed a day's temperature. A hand held, a light dimmed, a nurse waiting at the doorway, a hum that matched the bell. Clara climbed a small step, glanced at Elias, and spoke with a voice that kept salt and sunlight in it. She said a road once stole her balance. That safety helped her find words again, that people who waited without pushing handed her a bridge. She thanked nurses, therapists, housekeepers, guards, and the man who swept the path. Elias bowed his head and let applause move around him like a tide. Later, under a sky rinsed clean by wind, the three of them walked the empty courtyard. Footlights silvered the path. Rosemary held tiny stars of dew. The bell marked distance like a pulse everyone could share. Victor paused by the plaque near the hedge and touched its edges. He said wealth can buy walls and roofs, yet hearts open for other reasons. Elias said rooms learn from the people who fill them. Clara squeezed their hands and declared, "Together keeps me brave." They stood for a long spell, saying little, letting gratitude do its true work, which is to steady the next step. By spring, the center's reputation reached far towns. Families drove from farms and fishing ports because someone they trusted had said the place breathed gently. Referrals arrived from schools, shelters, and clinics. Partnerships were formed with tribal health workers who added wisdom about ancestral practices and land. A traveling team carried the method to emergency departments and taught how to build a harbor in 10 minutes on a stormy night. Elias trained new hires in slow entrances and honest silence, quoting no authority beyond experience. Victor built safeguards so culture would outlive tenure. Clara started a reading circle where kids wrote small poems about water, moss, light, and courage. Volunteers stitched them into a handmade book titled Breathing Rooms. On the anniversary of the word that turned the tide, the garden filled quietly. No balloons, only rosemary sprigs tucked into pockets. Clara stood at the rail and said, "I remember the first time I named the wave." Elias placed a smooth pebble on the bench in honor of every voice that had found daylight since. Victor thanked the staff with the fierce gentleness of a father still learning. Everyone listened while the sea performed its oldest lesson. Strength returned, again and again, without hurry. The story of a janitor, a CEO, and a child had become the story of a town, choosing care that does not shout. It waited, it listened, it worked. Carry it forward. If you believe rooms can change lives, help build them at this center or in your community. Support trauma-informed care. Volunteer an hour. Share expertise. Advocate for policies that protect calm, or pause before speaking to someone who hurts. Tell 3 friends what you witnessed here and ask them to pass it on. Join the movement for healing. Share this story.